Welcome to today's webinar on Ecological Fiscal Transfer in Malaysia, and thank you for joining us. My name is Hanis, and I will be your MC for today. This event is organized by UNDP in partnership with the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources, also known as KeTSA. It is held in conjunction with the International Day for Biological Diversity and the World Environment Day, which is celebrated on 22nd of May and 4th of June every year. This morning discussion aims to contribute toward policy discussion and knowledge sharing on the overall concept of ecological fiscal transfer, or EFT. EFT is a very new concept in Malaysia, first introduced in Budget 2021, but has since garnered a lot of interest among stakeholders. Hence, this webinar aims to first introduce a universal understanding of the concept of EFT. Second, provide information on the application of EFT nationally, including current trends and initiatives. And third, initiate a discussion of future application of the mechanism. Before we start, let me go through some housekeeping rules. For participants, please type your question in the Q&A. We will attempt to channel all your questions to the moderator for discussion. For your information, a recorded version of this webinar will be made available online after the session ends. To start the event, let me introduce Mr. Niloy Banerjee, the resident representative of UNDP Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam, to give his welcoming remarks. Mr. Niloy.
Thank you, Hanis. I'm sure you organized that stereophonic sound effect for Alec Baldwin and others to be speaking. But it was great. The message came across very, very clearly, even if the audio was not really cooperating. Good morning, excellencies, colleagues, guests, participants, welcome. I have the special pleasure to invite Zakiah binti Jaafar, Deputy Secretary General of Treasury in the Policy Unit of the Ministry of Finance, Datuk Johan Mahmood, Merican, National Budget Director, Ministry of Finance, Encik Chekodir, Director Environment and Natural Resource Division, Biasa in EPU. Good to see you again, Chekodir. And Dr Khairul Naim, Undersecretary Biodiversity Management at KeTSA. And friends, colleagues, my UNDP colleagues, thank you for all the hard work here. And to the audience out there, welcome to this. It's an exciting time. Tomorrow is, of course, World Environment Day, so I hope you've all got a little plan to do something for this planet of ours, which is so treasured. And the government of Malaysia, I have to say, is kind of leading the way. It's only a handful of countries that are thinking about actually putting a fiscal incentive on top of everything else, all the public relations campaigns that are out there to put a premium on the environment, to put a premium on the planet, and really working through fiscal policy instruments like tax revenues. So I'd like to congratulate the government, and we have our Finance Ministry, Environment Ministry, and EPU colleagues here. I think this is it. This is the core of the policy making muscle of this country, which is really thinking ahead. Goals 13, 14, and 15, climate change, oceans, and biodiversity. I call them, my staff always edit it out, I call them the teenage goals, the teenagers. They're like teenagers, they're extremely difficult to handle, but they're also very, very precious. I think these are three goals that have a degree of irreversibility to them. Every other goal in the whole pantheon of SDGs, the 17 goals, something can be done about them if you have crossed a certain line. But on these three, the margin for error is extremely, extremely thin. There is, we could easily go wrong and reach a point of no return. Last year, we did a human development report, colleagues. The human development report is UNDP's flagship report. We've been doing one every year since 1990. We trawl multiple data sets across the world, and we do what is an alternative construct to GDP, per capita GDP. It's really a per capita human development for countries. We use parameters like health and education and educational attainment, but also number of years expected to be in school. A child is expected to be in school at birth. So we use parameters like that, and we construct a composite index. So last year we did something fun. We said, we have the Human Development Index, and countries are ranked on a league table. Why don't we, on top of this index, why don't we control for environmental extraction? Why don't we see which country has managed to reach high levels of human development with a low planetary load, having caused minimal planetary destruction? And colleagues, it's not a pretty story. Almost no country in the world has gotten to high human development, high GDP per capita without extracting some price out of the planet. Even countries like Singapore, which are very high on the traditional human development index, when you put the planetary filter, when you control for some other parameters, it drops dramatically, almost 80 ranks. Singapore almost reaches an LDC status if you control for environmental extraction. So that's, as you know, Singapore is a big energy consumer, but also a big fossil fuel refinery. It's a big, so it kind of slips on the environmental count. Fiscal transfers are not, they sound boring, but most countries in the world, colleagues, as you know, financial devolution from federal to state to local is a very, very difficult topic. It's a hard one to crack. On what criteria does the federal government transfer financial resources to state and local governments? In India, we have every 5 years a finance commission that comes together to actually do the formula for fiscal devolution, because it needs to be also constantly revised and revisited. And here in Malaysia, I'm very, very proud to say we've, along with a handful of countries like India and Brazil, we've now introduced for the first time, beyond social and GDP and revenue KPIs and population KPIs, we have introduced fiscal transfers from federal to state government to compensate them for essentially conservation behavior. And this is, I congratulate the leadership of Malaysia. I congratulate you, the leaders who are in this call, who are in this webinar. It's your vision and passion which has driven this. And I'd really, really like to hear more today on how you, the public, see this and how we institutionalize this going forward in a way that the states of Malaysia can really, really begin to value this precious environmental assets that this country has as a mega biodiverse country anyway. So, so congratulations to you all. I'm going to stop here, and I'd like to wish you all a lovely World Environment Day tomorrow, and have a do something, the smallest thing for our planet here. Thank you very much, colleagues, and good morning to you all again. Over to you, Hannes.
Thank you, Mr. Niloy. Now, I would like to invite Puan Zakiah binti Jaafar, the Deputy Secretary General of Treasury, Policy, Ministry of Finance, to deliver the officiating address. Puan Zakiah.
Thank you, Hanis. Assalamualaikum and a very good morning, fellow colleagues near and far. It is indeed my honor to be among like-minded collaborators on green economy. So thank you to our host, the UNDP, for having us. But I must begin with an apology. For the Ministry of Finance is somewhat a latecomer in this venture. Although various green initiatives have been initiated by the MOF for some time now, it wasn't until budget 2021 that the sustainability agenda was truly entrenched. But now that the MOF is fully on board on the sustainability bandwagon, we can now talk business. If I may distract you from our current situation of the global pandemic that is COVID-19, we are also facing a crisis of sorts in terms of biodiversity loss and climate change, both of which have no vaccine or quick fix to remedy the situation. The Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity, published in February of this year, revealed that global biodiversity is declining at an unprecedented and alarming rate. Scientists and researchers believe we are entering the era of Anthropocene extinction, where current extinction rates can be up to 1,000 times higher than the baseline rate. Such declines are seriously undermining nature's productivity, resilience, and adaptability, which in turn pose extreme risk and uncertainty for our economies and well-being. The solution of this will require a full recognition and understanding of the true value of nature, the goods and services it provides, which are not reflected in conventional economics nor market prices. We need to recognize that they are a part of the mainstream capital stock of our country, which are vital to people, livelihood, and our unique wildlife. We are fortunate as Malaysia is considered one of the 12 mega diverse countries and blessed with one of the oldest rainforests in the world, a wide array of coastal, marine and terrestrial ecosystems, and endemic species such as the Malayan tiger and the orangutan. Maybe we can learn from the People's Republic of China, who has since adopted the concept of an ecological civilization where lucid waters, green forests, and lush mountains are invaluable assets to their nation and thus should be treated as such. The Malaysian government fully recognized the importance of sustainability underpinning the country's development trajectory towards a sustainable and inclusive nation and remain committed to the sustainable development goals. Our latest progress showed that most SDGs related to the socio-economic dimension are progressing relatively well, but are underperforming for those related to environment. Hence, it is timely that we give greater focus on SDG 13, climate action, SDG 14, life in water, and SDG 15, life on land. Within the Malaysian government, the SDGs have been fully assimilated in our 5-year development plans, beginning with the 11th Malaysia Plan. I can assure you the sustainability agenda in the upcoming 12th Malaysia Plan is sturdier and more comprehensive. But maybe I shouldn't have claimed that. Sometimes I forgot that I'm no longer in EPU. But as a former representative for MOF, I can claim that for the first time, the SDGs are aligned to our annual budget, beginning with budget 2021. We have also volunteered to lead the working group on finance for sustainable development under the SDG Steering Committee. In a recent stock taking of green initiatives relating to finance, we realized we have done quite a lot. So we need not start from scratch. It's more of a matter of coordination now with related ministries and agencies, including Bank Negara Malaysia and the Securities Commission. An important recent institutional improvement is the establishment of a Climate Change Action Council 2 months ago, chaired by our Prime Minister himself. We finally got our act together as this council brings together all the economic ministries and state governments to ensure policy alignment regarding climate change issues and the green development agenda. But there is only one side of the coin. The other would be ensuring implementation and enforcement are equally effective. Investing in nature through fiscal transfers from the federal to state governments is among the key challenges of decentralization worldwide. We are not alone in this. All federated states, from the United States to Indonesia, have different, imperfect, but work in progress models. How and under what conditionalities do federal budget devolve to state governments remains a trillion-dollar question worldwide. That is particularly challenging for the decentralization of environmental and natural resource issues, which is normally not part of the traditional intergovernmental fiscal transfer mechanism. In Malaysia, the Ecological Fiscal Transfer was first announced in Budget 2019 with 60 million ringgit allocation to state governments for protected area management, and Budget 2021 with 70 million ringgit allocation to ensure sustainability of the country's biodiversity. These budget announcements set an early trajectory towards putting in place a fiscal instrument that will incentivize decentralized conservation efforts. We expect that the state governments maximize this allocation to protect and conserve biodiversity and ecosystems within their respective jurisdiction. This EFT allocation also has the potential to leverage financial flows from financial institutions, private sector, and donors for the purpose of nature conservation. The UN Malaysia is our firm development partner in this area. The MOF is working with them under a special program led by the UNDP to strengthen the financing for national sustainable development priorities and the SDGs. The integrated national financing framework and constitutes platforms for innovation and reforms spanning from policy, regulation, financial instruments, and institutions, including public-private collaboration. The framework provides risk-informed tools to better prepare for future crises, from climate to biodiversity and health. It can help sequence government action considering multiple policy objectives and limited financial resources. The acceleration of the SDGs demand a realignment of public and private investment decisions, and this is one aspect that is covered in that framework. The MOF also recognizes that a sustainable financial system is a necessary foundation for Malaysia to address its national development priorities and meet its international commitments, enabling a long-term and inclusive prosperity for its citizens. However, we still need to develop a complete, unified, and explicit conceptual framework for sustainable finance. This finance roadmap, which is collaboration with the UK's Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions initiative, seeks to enhance coherence among a wide range of existing initiatives in the field of sustainability and inclusion. As part of the initiatives under Budget 2021, a My SDG Fund will be established to meet the financing gap in pursuing the SDGs, especially for those programs and projects which may be off the radar on the priority list of the government. I'm happy to share the news that the process to get the fund established is nearing the tail end, and we hope to get it off the ground in a couple of months' time, inshallah. In moving forward, if I may be so bold to say that all these financial tools are but one piece of the jigsaw puzzle in the whole climate change picture, it may go a long way to incentivize behavioral change among economic actors to better appreciate our natural assets. But I firmly believe that until and unless there is a real mindset change among all the stakeholders to better appreciate, protect, conserve, and nurture our natural assets, no amount of incentives can guarantee a truly sustainable development. So a paradigm shift in holding our natural assets with high regards is key. Nevertheless, a Chinese proverb does say, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. With the UNDP as our partner and capitalizing on its catalytic role and expertise through its various initiatives, I am confident that our journey together to institutionalize EFT in Malaysia alongside our stakeholders will be one of our success SDG stories. With that, it gives me great pleasure to officiate this webinar. I hope all of you will have a productive day ahead. Thank you and stay safe.
Thank you, Puan Zakiah. Next, let me welcome Ms. Gan Pek Chuan, the Interim Head Sustainable and Resilient Development, SRD at UNDP Malaysia. Ms. Gan has extensive expertise in the field of environmental policy and management, with over 20 years of working experience in the public and private sectors. At UNDP Malaysia, she provides advisory support on policy and project design to the Government of Malaysia and relevant stakeholders. Ms. Gan will present the first paper titled Ecological Fiscal Transfer for Conservation of Biodiversity, the concept, best practices, and lesson learned. Ms. Gan.
Thank you, Hanis. Good morning, distinguished guests, Zakiah, Datuk Johan, Dr. Naim, and our colleagues from UNDP, Niloy and Manon. So I'll share my screen to go through a few slides with all of you about ecological fiscal transfer. So first, let's look at, how biodiversity as the foundation, to all, economic and anthropogenic or human activities, in the world. And this shows how it links to the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, from biodiversity to SDGs, and in turn, how the SDGs interacts with the biodiversity. So you can see from this picture, from the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5th report that produced by the Convention of Biological Diversity Secretariat. And next slide, you will see the progress towards the IG biodiversity targets that was agreed by all the nations in the world who are signatory to the convention. And you will see the progress are in sort of like in a colored dashboard, which is on track to exceed or to on track to reach. Some are in yellow, some progress, or it can be no significant progress. And you will notice, just across the 20 targets, most of as a collective results, you will see that our progress rests a lot on some progress, but not in an efficient manner to address the loss of biodiversity and ecosystems that we are experiencing now. So, which means we really need to do, to have more ambitious and really up our game towards addressing these loss of biodiversity issue. And one of the ways that in some countries has been experiencing or exploring is to see whether we can address this loss of biodiversity through finance solutions. Fiscal transfer is one of them. So what is fiscal transfer? It's a scheme where public revenue is redistributed through transfer from national or central government to subnational government, to all subnational government to local government. This is to ensure adequate fiscal capacity to perform the public functions at the state or local level. So you can see the revenue can be in the form of tax, duties, interest or proceeds or fees, that are cumulative, or accrue at the federal level, and this is shared with the state and share with the local level. So this is not new in Malaysia. There's already a form of fiscal transfer from federal government to state government. Yeah. And why do we call ecological fiscal transfer? Essentially, it's a transfer of public revenue between federal and state governments within a country, but based on ecological or environmental indicators or criteria. So these criteria can be related to protected areas. That means protected areas means, the coverage of your national parks or state parks, water catchment areas, and it could be about forest cover. So why do we need to have ecological fiscal transfer? First of all, because the benefits that generate from the goods and services from the biodiversity in ecosystems, it's not just confined to the local level. It actually benefits at the national and even at the global level. Just like, Malaysia's oldest rainforest is one of the largest carbon stocked for the world. Yeah. But most of the cost related to the conservation actions and management of biodiversity and ecosystems are borne by the subnational and the local level, which is why ecological fiscal transfer is seen as a means or way to overcome the mismatch between the environmental benefits and the cost of ecosystem conservation. And these costs is considered or comprised of actual management cost and opportunity cost. And it also helps us to address the issue of underfinance for environmental goods and services at the state and also local level. And this is something not new in Malaysia too. So there are some already quite well established ecological fiscal transfer practices in the world. You can see that in Brazil, which has been in practice since 1991, or in Portugal, France, and then India, and also China. So essentially, these are the 5 countries who have a lot of experience in EFT. So this leads me to introduce you about a specific EFT, case study or experience in Brazil. In Brazil, 25% of their GST or VAT receipts, they call it ICMS, are transferred to local governments. And this VAT constitutes about 84.5% of all the revenues in 2010, which is also a primary source of their state and also local fiscal revenues. Paraná is the first state government to implement the ecological ICMS, or in this case, we call it ecological fiscal transfer formula, where 5% out of this 25% of the municipal share is distributed again according to ecological considerations. So overall, you have 100% of the VAT receipts or proceeds. Then from 25%, this is transferred to the municipalities, and another 25% out of this is distributed based on ecological indicators. So it started as a compensation for land use restriction, but over the years, it has evolved into an incentive to create and maintain protected areas in the state of Paraná. And the ecological criteria that they have put in place is the officially registered protected areas. That means the size of the protected areas, watershed protected areas, and other criteria such as solid waste disposal, sanitation system, soil protection. So you are looking at a combination of different environmental criteria. So it's not just related to one set of indicators. And look at the results over the years, how these fiscal transfer has resulted in the increase of the protected area coverage in Brazil. And you can look at the graph, in particularly from 1993 to 2009, there is an exponential increase in terms of the size of protected area in Brazil, whether at the federal level, state, or at municipal level. So it does have a positive effect in terms of biodiversity or conservation. So what is the conditions of an effective EFT? And of course, when I'm listing down these conditions, it's actually based on the experience, from all these established EFT around the world. It's not just drawing from the Brazil case study. First of all, we need to have a strong political view. And this is, you can see that from the announcement, from the budget speech in 2019 and 2021. And hopefully this political view can transcend into future budget allocations. And there must be a specific goal and purpose. What's the purpose of having the ecological fiscal transfer? To act as a compensation for state foregone revenue or opportunity costs, or actually to serve as an incentive or refinancing, or it can be a mixture of these different purposes. Then we also observe that in order to have a good functioning of an ecological fiscal transfer, you need to have a strong policy or law, a decree, or even an effective administrative procedures that specify the functioning or the authorization of the EFT. And you need an institution with fiscal administration and influential power across different ministries, departments, and different levels of government at federal, at state, and local level. And we need to identify who are the beneficiaries or actors in this scheme. Public actors, state or local governments, aligned with private actors such as civil society or private sector. And of course, any transfer of funds will need to based on a set of criteria. And hopefully this can be done in consultation and agree, with beneficiaries and actors. And of course, lastly, we also need to take into consideration the conservation competencies of the beneficiaries who is going to perform, or to implement the conservation actions at the local level. So if the incentive for decentralized conservation efforts are to have an effect. So what is the benefits of the EFT? So it can help to incentivize public conservation efforts at state and local level. It does not require any additional finance since it's normally just based on a change in the current distribution of revenue. And of course, thirdly, it partly decentralizes the decision on where to protect the nature, taking into account, the local preferences and also benefiting from the local knowledge. As this is also quite clearly, specified or laid out in our federal constitutions between the distribution of legislative powers between federal and states. It also involves relatively low transaction costs for implementing such scheme, since it builds on the existing fiscal transfer from federal to state. And of course, taking into account the growing body of evidence and also simulations of different EFT practices in other countries, in particularly, the mega diverse countries such as Brazil, India, and China. But it does have challenges and limitations, as we say, based on the conditions of an effective EFT. It needs to have sufficient political view and momentum to change the revenue distribution mechanism. It also requires cross-departmental or cross-ministerial cooperation. In particular, in this case, will be between the fiscal administration and also the conservation officials. And it also, to fully utilize this allocation through the EFT, you also require a mix of municipal conservation competencies. You need to have, institutions with relative good capacity to implement conservation actions. And finally, every EFT scheme needs to be tailor-made according to the fiscal constitutions if it needs to be adapted. So these are some of the references you can make if you're interested to find out more about ecological fiscal transfer. So I will just stop my presentation and proceed with the next presentation with our government counterparts and partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gan. Ladies and gentlemen, please remember to type your question in the Q&A. Please do indicate your name and organization you are representing. If you are asking a question in your personal capacity, then kindly indicate your name only. Next, let me welcome our second speaker, Datuk Johan Mahmood Merican, National Budget Director from the Ministry of Finance Malaysia. Before serving the government in various capacities since 2009, Datuk Johan worked in the private sector for 9 years in corporate finance and accounting. He is a trained chartered accountant and holds a degree in economics from the University of Cambridge. Datuk Johan's paper is titled Ecological Fiscal Transfer based on Economics, Infrastructure and Welfare Development Based Grant or TAHAP in Malaysia. Datuk Johan.
So Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Assalamualaikum and a very good morning to everyone. First, let me extend my thanks to Mr. Niloy on behalf of UNDP for kindly inviting me. Obviously, Puan Zakiah, Jaafar, my boss, Dr Khairul Naim from KeTSA, Cik Kode from EPU, Ms. Gan, also all my fellow panelists and Brita, the moderator later, and ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I would like to say that Puan Zakiah is actually my immediate boss, and she's certainly a true ESG champion that we have in the Ministry of Finance. Certainly bringing over from the work that she did in EPU in coordinating the Malaysian government's SDG efforts. I must confess, I was a little bit hesitant and unsure being invited to this forum where I trust many attending are experts and very knowledgeable in the space of environment, whereas I'm just a bean counter, the budget director for the Ministry of Finance. But I guess as what Puan Zakiah alluded to, she said MOF is a bit late to come into this, but I guess better late than never. And perhaps one recurring theme, and perhaps this was already touched on in what Niloy is speaking, and even what Puan Zakiah had spoken about, is that we have at least Malaysia is very blessed with in terms of our biodiversity assets, but there are many obviously structural issues relating to this issue. And when MOF looks at this, so unlike EPU that looks at our 5-year plans and longer term planning, MOF in terms of budget processes tend to very much look at it in a more short term and 1-year cycle. We look to see what can be done in the immediate term, very much ideally in partnership, including with the likes of UNDP, stakeholders, NGOs, and the rest. And so we probably take approach in trying to undertake things on a shorter term basis. What can be done in the immediate term, perhaps as steps in the right direction. And I guess we always take the view of let's not let the perfect be enemy of good in trying to implement measures to advance this environmental agenda. So with that in mind, that perhaps is something that brings us to the EFT. I've just got a very few number of slides to run through. So as already mentioned by Puan Zakiah, the Ecological Fiscal Transfer was first announced in Budget 2019. And I should record thanks to the UNDP because its announcement actually did trace back to some discussions that the Ministry of Finance had with UNDP, actually at the UNDP office. prior, in our stakeholder engagement on the budget. It was an idea which was shared, and we thought, well, basically, why not? Certainly makes a lot of sense. Ms. Gan made a very compelling case in her presentation. And in last year's budget, it was then increased further to 70 million. And maybe I should just make the point that whilst Ms. Gan had in her presentation one of the advantages that it's at no additional cost because it uses existing transfers. I just wanted to mention, actually, for this ecological fiscal transfer, it is actually additional allocation, new money that's added on to already the 7 billion of transfers from federal government to state. So while before everyone gets excited over the very large number, so it needs to be highlighted that most transfers from federal government to state are subject to various laws, and which then determine its quantum. And so there's actually little scope sometimes in terms of repackaging or redefining existing grants from federal to state. And thus, when we were looking at this, actually that then needed to be a fresh disbursement to the state. We have, as part of the grants from federal to state, there is a specific grant called TAHAP, which actually links to basically the state of economic development, infrastructure, and livelihood. So this with an EFT of 70 million, actually the total TAHAP is actually 400 million. So under the terms of the TAHAP, it's actually disbursed on a reimbursable basis. So it is for state governments then to spend on something that meets the criteria in order then to access this grant. But in that respect, I then perhaps need to highlight that when this was first introduced back in 2019, we announced 60 million, but in actual terms, less than 60 million was eventually used, and perhaps in the first year, maybe there's an element of one, lack of awareness potentially at the state governments on accessing this allocation, and secondly, perhaps it also takes time also for the respective state governments also to develop projects that's applicable. So one thing that we've done, actually, given the last 2 years of underutilization, this year we've taken a little bit of a leap of faith by actually fully disbursing the 70 million, but at least stating that this money is transferred first, but with basically stipulating the conditions on how it is supposed to be used. So hopefully this year's experiment would then be positive. If the couple years previous it was not fully utilized, we hope that this year, with the money in hand and with stipulated conditions, that the states then will use it fully as per its intended use. One thing that we have announced, and it's great that we have Dr. Khairul Naim in today's session, is that we've basically announced, at least to the state governments, that from next year onwards, the actual disbursement or distribution of the 70 million allocation will be determined by KeTSA in terms of criteria from their side. So we also hope that perhaps makes it a bit more rigorous, and also and hopefully then aligns the state to what the sort of agendas that KeTSA is driving. I then move on, I guess, back to the theme of not letting the perfect be enemy of good, because we made this announcement first and then tried to then figure out later how are we then supposed to distribute the 60-70 million. So later on, I think KeTSA will be sharing, I think they have developed a more comprehensive and holistic set of 9 criteria to look at for this. But when at least the Ministry of Finance first announced it back in, late 2018, as mentioned by Ms. Gan, the intention of an EFT at the end of the day is how do you then encourage the state first in terms of land use restriction. And in that respect, we thought that the first starting point is we want to then encourage the respective state governments to gazette more land in terms of protected and gazetted areas. What you see on screen is obviously the total land mass of the different states and what's the total gazetted area. And we used that as a starting point to think about how we could possibly then allocate these funds. So one of the first issues then we realized is that if we do it just based on the existing total gazetted areas, you will end up with a very unequal distribution, because as you can see from it, almost 37% of the total gazetted areas of the country is in Sarawak, 28% in Sabah, 12% in Pahang. If it's purely skewed based on existing gazetted areas, that would leave precious little for the other states. And then sometimes there are also delays in gazetting of areas, and perhaps some states may restrict use, but not necessarily by gazetting. And I guess a case in point would be Kedah, which in that particular year had cut back in terms of logging in specific areas, particularly in the water catchment areas, but that wasn't gazetted. So it was an action taken by the state in the right direction, but given if it was just a formula based on gazetted areas, they would not benefit. So those were a couple of operational issues. The other thing that we looked at is then maybe looking at what would then be the ratio of gazetted areas as a percentage of the total area of the state. Because I think, as I mentioned, if we were purely looking at the absolute number of gazetted areas, then that would be very skewed towards some of the larger states. So we thought, in an effort to be more equitable, we should also find a means to encourage even the smaller states, if they then are able to demonstrate a higher percentage of gazetting their land area. So there is first the one consideration, at least in the first cycle of distributing the EFT in terms of the notional ceiling for each state. So we took into account the total gazetted area. Secondly, a percentage of the gazetted area for the state, and third, because as we are thinking about not just what is the existing stock of land that's restricted in use, we also would ideally want to also motivate additional. So ideally wanting the formula to also give weightage for the increase in gazetted areas more so than the existing stock. So these are some of the preliminary considerations that we used, but I hope you can see that certainly operationalizing it has certain challenges, but I guess it's a start. It's still a relatively new grant, and we hope that over time we will improve, and especially with next year having KeTSA to really then be a bit more rigorous in its distribution, we hope that would then further improve the allocation of this ecological fiscal transfer. Maybe then just to just put it on the slide in terms of some of the implementation challenges of EFT. So the first, as explained in the previous slide, is how do we then really establish a criteria that achieves equitable distribution, that tries to not be unduly skewed just to the large states, but also provide enough to give some motivation to the smaller states, especially the smaller states that might even have less resources to support such an agenda. The second one is probably more important, because one is actually having the amount. The second one is how do you structure the EFT to incentivize the behavior. We thought initially the reimbursement model of the TAHAP was good, because then it says that you don't get it unless you spend on that, but that in itself seemed to have a low take-up. And as mentioned in also the previous slide, perhaps weighting the criteria or distribution or the allocation of funds more towards the increase in gazetted areas or new initiatives that's undertaken by the states, rather than numerical criteria based on existing stock or what they have already. That perhaps is probably important in the design of improving the EFT formula going forward. But a maybe more practical problem is that perhaps at its current level, where it's now only at 70 million, admittedly with that size, and once you split it up between the various states, what they individually get perhaps is perhaps too small to compensate, especially if we're trying to motivate states, especially to cut back on logging, specific areas. This really needs to look back, and perhaps more study needs to be done. What really needs to be the scale to then make it meaningful as a real incentive or an alternative for the state to motivate them to preserve and safeguard more land mass. And then the last is really in terms of ensuring that the utilization of EFT is in line with the agenda. Because as I mentioned, especially in the first year, we didn't really get much take up. And then to what extent we really then need to, should there even be a validation process of which projects can be then approved as utilization of the EFT? That's perhaps also another implementation issue, because otherwise then you could just have the grants being disbursed and not really having any real meaningful impact on the ground. So I think those are really some of the implementation issues that we face, at least in the first couple of years of introducing this initiative. Certainly we acknowledge the assistance of KeTSA, and we're quite looking forward to working with KeTSA to make sure that this is improved going forward. Whilst today's conversation is focusing on ecological fiscal transfer, I thought I'll just close with one slide on items that we've announced in budget. I guess that's our bread and butter in MOF, talking about budgets. And when we look at budgets, I mentioned we tend to look on just 1 year time horizons. And I think particularly on environment, I think one of the messages, and maybe to reiterate what Puan Zakiah also mentioned, I think we're certainly very open and looking forward to doing partnerships. And even if, as I mentioned, don't let the perfect be an enemy of the good, we can't solve everything in one go, but we certainly look forward to what are immediate first steps that we can do towards that. And so just giving you a flavor of some of the items that we have put in past budgets, for example, budget 2020, there was some allocation specifically for protection of animals, and that ideally was something to be done in collaboration. There was also this initiative on employing forest rangers from retired soldiers and also local Orang Asli communities. Actually, in budget 2019, there was also one collaboration with UNDP on Orang Aslis as well, and that was followed up by announcement of a matching grant in the 2020 budget, although that's still in a design process. Budget 2021, as mentioned, we increased our ecological fiscal transfer from 60 to 70 million. As Puan Zakiah said, we also announced the formation of a My SDG fund. And again, that's to help seed projects in collaboration with private sector and civil society, and that's due to be launched later this year. Although what we've preceded that is the launch of our sustainability bond, which was well received by the financial markets. The third item there is, again, a collaboration that we're doing with the UNDP, again, recognizing that sometimes, we have beautiful islands, but they don't remain that way, especially if resorts just pump in the sewage straight into the sea, which obviously is detrimental for corals and also biodiversity. So this is another area that, again, it's a pilot that we're working with UNDP. SAVE was a program with SEDA on encouraging people to buy energy efficient, air conditioning and fridges. And again, we continue to do efforts to promote Orang Asli involvement in environment protection. And certainly, as we are actually just about to start our budget 2022 process, we certainly look forward to proposals, recommendations for partnerships that we can do either with UNDP, specifically on EFT, or in the more broader agenda on environment. And with that, thank you very much.
Now, let's welcome our third speaker, Dr. Khairul Naim, the Undersecretary of Biodiversity and Forestry Management Division under the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources. Dr. Khairul Naim holds a PhD in Environment and Development from University Kebangsaan Malaysia. He has served the government holding a number of portfolios across various ministries. He is also registered as a professional technologist in the field of green technology with the Malaysian Board of Technologies, MBOT. Dr. Khairul paper is titled Utilization of Existing Public Budget Allocations Towards Achieving of the National Policy on Biological Diversity 2016 to 2025 at state level. Dr. Khairul Naim.
Thank you, Ms. Hanis, for your kind introduction. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and a very good morning. Yang berusaha Puan Zakiah Jaafar, Yang Berbahagia Datuk Johan, Mr. Niloy, Banerjee, Encik Kadir, Encik Kodir Bahrum, and also Miss Manon Bernia, UNDP Deputy Residents, distinguished fellow panelists, participants, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I would like to thank UNDP for inviting me, representing Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources, to this program. It is my great pleasure to share some insights on the topic given about utilization of existing public budget allocations towards achieving the national policy on biodiversity. In fact, it is not only at the state level, but also at the federal level. Let me share my screen. One moment. Okay. Looking at the presentation outline, I will first share some background of Malaysia's richness in biodiversity, Malaysia's commitment at the international as well as at the national level, the key issues and challenges in managing our biodiversity, and also the policy direction. I will also provide example about the existing public budget allocation that contribute significantly to the achievement of national policy on biological diversity. I will use its acronym NPBD throughout my presentation. I will also present some of our policy impact analysis, whereby we look at the initiative versus NPBD targets. Then we will be looking at the potential of EFT and finally the way forward. Ladies and gentlemen, Malaysia is one of the world's mega diverse countries. Mega diverse country reflects that Malaysia holds at least 70% of global biodiversity. And if we look at the National Biodiversity Index, Malaysia is ranked 12. As we can see in the slide, Malaysia has a variety of ecosystems as well as abundance of flora and fauna species. Being a mega diverse country is great, but managing biodiversity is indeed very challenging. In this view, Malaysia needs a strong collaborative effort in the form of human resources, in the form of financial resources, in order to safeguard its biodiversity. On the global front, Malaysia takes its commitment towards biodiversity conservation seriously. Malaysia has pledged to maintain at least 50% of its land under forest and tree cover during Rio summit way back in 1992. Today, after almost 30 years, Malaysia has not reneged on the pledge by maintaining, if you can see the percentage on the upper side of your right-hand side, maintaining 55.31% of forest cover, or about 18.28 million hectares of total land areas. This figure shows Malaysia's commitment in conserving and sustainably manage our national resources. Malaysia's approach to biodiversity conservation and management is driven by the establishment of protected areas through a legal gazettement. At the global level, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, Aceh Biodiversity Target 11 aims at achieving at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas by 2020. At the national level, we are using national policy on biological diversity, where NPBD stated that by 2025, at least 20% of terrestrial areas and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas are conserved. As of 2018, the terrestrial and marine protected area coverage for Malaysia are 10% and 5.3% respectively. And we still have another 5 years to go in order to accomplish or to fulfill the national policy on biological diversity. To meet global targets and aspiration, Malaysia has become party to various multilateral environment agreements. And this commitment must be translated into various measures for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity have also been emphasized within the context of sustainable development, where biodiversity conservation objectives are embedded within SDGs, mainly SDG 14, life below water, and 15 on life on land. In recognizing the importance of biodiversity, Malaysia has formulated national policy on biological diversity for a period of 10 years, from 2016 to 2025, in line with Aichi biodiversity target. As you can see, this diagram summarizes the whole structure of MPBD, where it has 5 overarching goals, supported by 17 targets, and each target is accompanied by a set of actions. The ultimate objective is in line with the 3 objectives of the CBD: to conserve biodiversity, to promote its sustainable use, and also to be fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of biological resources. As I pointed out earlier, Malaysia is facing various challenges in fulfilling its international and national commitment. Among other key challenges is segmented jurisdiction between states and federal governments, as well as between implementing ministries and agencies. Growing economy coupled with the rising population of the country has exerted pressure on biodiversity. And we also have limited capacity for managing effectively biodiversity conservation due to inadequate human and financial resources. Ladies and gentlemen, biodiversity conservation is costly and requires significant amount of funding over a period of time before it can generate visible achievement. Fragmentation of forests also affects the flora and fauna and creates potential human-wildlife conflict due to poor forest connectivity. These, among others, have threatened the survival of our valuable biodiversity. Now let's look at the public budget allocation and its contribution to MPBD. It has been also highlighted by Zakiah and Datuk Johan just now. With regard to public budget allocation, the introduction of EFT to states, as well as the implementation of strategic wildlife enforcement initiative through biodiversity protection and patrolling program known as BP3, which also includes Operasi Bersepadu Khazanah or OBK, among others, are among significant biodiversity conservation initiative under the 2020 and 2021 budget. But BP3 is a good example to showcase the utilization of public allocations toward achieving MPBD targets. It can be happen also at the state levels. Thank you, MOF, for approving and providing the allocations for BP3 starting in 2020 and another 20 million to continue the program and also to expand the implementation in 2021. For those who are not familiar with what BP3 is all about, is that BP3 is a strategic enforcement initiative between Department of Wildlife and National Parks, Perkhidmatan, and various enforcement agencies, including Royal Malaysian Police, Custom, State Forestry Department, and etc., to combat trespassing and also uh, to combat illegal poaching and logging. As of now, a total of 570 wildlife rangers among retired soldiers and Royal Malaysian Police and local communities, which is Orang Asli, have been appointed in 2021. Other than providing them with employment opportunities, their experience and expertise has enhanced the effectiveness of enforcement in this country. And BP3 has proven a success. OBK, as part of BP3 program, won the international recognition based on its success, as you can see in the video during our break session just now. Looking at the achievement, in 2019, 87 wildlife criminals were arrested with a total seizure valued at 2.7 million. And in 2020, a total seizure was of 1.85 million ringgit. Okay, now the significance of BP3 on NPBD. By utilizing public budget allocation for BP3, it contributes in achieving at least 5 targets of NPBD, including target 1, 2, 10, 11, and 15. We will go through briefly from one target to another to look how BP3 produce impacts. For target 1, the implementation and the success of BP3 has increased the public awareness. It sensitizes the public on the importance of protecting and conserving biodiversity. BP3 also encourages public participation in reporting illegal flora and fauna or other trade activities. BP3 also promotes community enforcement that enable indigenous people and local communities to be involved in biodiversity conservation. This will increase contribution of indigenous people and local communities towards protecting our precious biodiversity. For target 11, this is I think the most significant effect of BP3, where BP3 reduces poaching, illegal logging, and illegal trade of flora and fauna. And at the same time, it increases joint enforcement program among various agencies. It also enhances enforcement of legislation and increased capacity for and collaboration amongst government agencies. The 5 MPBD targets supported by BP3 clearly indicated how public budget can significantly affect or significantly contribute towards the achieving of national policy on biological diversity. Coming back to our topic today on EFT, we will look at the potential of EFT. I will skip the introduction. I will straight away go to the potential of EFT. As we can see in the diagram, EFT has a great potential. With funding from EFT, states can contribute to various targets under MPBD. Based on our analysis, EFT supports half of the targets of NPBD and involving three key goals, namely goal number 1, 2, and 3. EFT contributes to target 17 on funding and resource mobilization and target 6 in increasing the percentage of protected areas. It also support target 5 on tourism and target 7 to target 11 on safeguarding ecosystem. I have the detail of each target of how EFT can contribute significantly. But probably we can discuss this further in our Q&A session. And as a way forward, our analysis has demonstrated that public budget allocation are significant to achieve the targets set in NPBD and provide multiple benefits to the states in terms of social and economy. There is a positive significant correlation between public budget allocation with biodiversity conservation. This can be seen in BP3, where it becomes a powerful means to conserve biodiversity and the spillover to socio-economic development. In the context of EFT, the theory of change is that we need to institutionalize EFT. Ms. Gan has highlighted 7 conditions for an effective EFT. So we need to take into account these 7 conditions in order to make our EFT mechanism efficient and effective. Within EFT, the introduction of quality indicators and the effective monitoring and evaluation of disbursement and spending of EFT funds can improve the outcomes of EFT. Adequate and substantial technical and financial resources are needed for success implementation of biodiversity conservation. However, present financial resources are not yet sufficient to address the loss of opportunity costs faced by states due to the development restriction imposed by various environmental related policies. Hence, another economic instrument, for example, payment for ecosystem services, conservation fees and subsidies, rate plus mechanism should be explored for conservation purposes. Last but not least, the revenue basis of the state government need to be improved and diversified to reduce states' reliance or dependency on natural resources. Towards achieving this, a holistic biodiversity financing plan is needed to figure out of how to leverage the potential resources for biodiversity conservation. Before I conclude, thank you again to UNDP, and we hope that MOF will consider adequate financial resources for the purpose of safeguarding our precious biodiversity, which is very crucial for the well-being of the rakyat. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khairul Naim. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at the key session of the day, the panel discussion. To moderate the panel discussion is Ms. Prita Sankar, an advocate and solicitor specializing in environmental law and policy. She is currently serving UNDP Malaysia as the environmental legal specialist. Ladies and gentlemen, please remember to type your question in the Q&A. Please do indicate your name and the organization you are representing. If you are asking a question in your personal capacity, then kindly indicate your name only. Ms. Prita, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Hannes, and a very good morning to all the participants. Firstly, for diligently staying with the webinar this morning. Thank you to all the panelists as well for your presentations. Looking at the Q&A this morning, I have to say that as the moderator, I have relatively the easiest job on the panel this morning. But also by virtue of being the moderator, I have the privilege of asking one or two questions to the panelists directly, bearing in mind that we've decided to allocate much of the discussion today to facilitate the questions that have come in from the participants this morning. So I'll address the questions in order of presentation. So Ms. Gunn, this is the first question for you from me this morning, and thank you for your presentation and highlighting the EFT at the universal conceptual level. Drawing from your presentation this morning, and I am cognizant of the fact that UNDP is also a keen advocate of EFT, and I'm sure that you'll be following the evolving nature of EFT in Malaysia quite closely, and probably very much involved in the process of unfolding it as well. But that said, could you highlight specifically in the national context, borrowing from what would make EFT, the conditions of making EFT successful, what will be particularly useful for Malaysia to borrow or practice from the best practices?
Thank you, Prita. Yeah, drawing from the experiences from other countries, I would say Malaysia already has a very positive, you can say a positive motivation or intention already enshrined in the announcement in the budget speech. This is very clearly stated, as the budget announcement in 2019 and also 2021. So, and you already started off with a modest allocation, as Datuk Johan always emphasized. But with that, I think what we need now to move forward, the EFT scheme in Malaysia, we would need to, and of course we know that the allocation to the states is based on the TAHAP. There is a guidelines under the Berkeliling. So, but we still, I think, in terms of the actual criteria and indicators that we want to factor into that TAHAP, it needs more clarity and deliberation, and hopefully, we can also include wider consultation with stakeholders on the technical aspects of these criteria. No doubt, I think we can build on the existing transfer mechanism that the government has already established. More importantly, I think this is still not, engaged, they still need to have a lot of engagement with our state counterparts, because ultimately the states are the main beneficiaries and they are the ones who, most of the critical conservation happens at the state local level. Yeah. I hope you're hearing me all right. So,
right.
As a way forward, I still see that you need a very close collaboration, at least at federal level, between MOF and KeTSA. KeTSA definitely will need the technical expertise in advising the best, ecological criteria that needs to be factored into the scheme. Yeah. And of course, MOF is in the position to advise what would be the best disbursement mechanism based on the lessons from the previous allocations to the states.
Right. Ms. Khan, following from that, would you be able to identify if there are perceptions about EFT? Looking through some of the Q&A this morning, there are questions about what's the difference between EFT and PES, for example. So I suppose there is a lot of also misconceptions about what EFT possibly is as a mechanism. But how do we actually make the perceptions about EFT actually better? Are there processes to bring it to the front line to make this more clarified in that sense? Do you think there are processes we can undertake to do that?
Yes, definitely. Looking at the range of questions and questions that are already posted, it seems that a lot of people already has their own perception about how the EFT should work and how the EFT should look like. Some will say, you know, we should start compensating the state for their foreign revenues or opportunity cost. But, you know, as rightly pointed out by Datuk Johan, and also, you know, this is a very modest allocations compared to other form of fiscal transfer that the states that receive from the federal. I think for Malaysia, as the starting point, it looks more like an incentive, you know, for states to initiate some good conservation efforts and actions. Then we'll take from there and see whether any lessons and feedback, you know, from our state beneficiaries, and see, you know, there is any other, you know, opportunities or rooms to devise and evolve this scheme into, you know, to serve other purposes. And I'm sure, you know, KeTSA is also like to see, you know, ultimately, I don't think we will reach a quantum or allocation amount that is able to match, you know, ringgit to ringgit in terms of what you can generate from the revenue of a timber extraction, you know, or from logging, yeah, or even from mining. So, which is why I think for Malaysia as a starting point, does seems a perfect opportunity to serve as an incentive. And I also look at there's some questions about debt for nature debt for nature swap. Debt for nature swap and ecological fiscal transfer are two very different finance mechanisms. As you know, debt for nature swap is more about, you know, giving the opportunities to the developing country who has a lot of external debts or foreign debts, you know, in exchange for the commitments in biodiversity conservation. But in Malaysia, we do not have a lot of external debts. I'm sure Datuk Johan will advise better about the situation. Most of our debt are actually domestic, so it doesn't quite work relevant in Malaysia's context. But of course, if you look into the situation, if some state does have or do have budget deficit situation, whether you want to explore the ecological fiscal transfer as a way to address the budget deficit situation at the states in exchange of their commitments for increased conservation actions or efforts, then of course that I will have to, you know, divert that question back to Ministry of Finance. Yeah.
So, Dr. Johan, back to you. A question for you. You talked about the allocations already being advanced to the states in this sense. Could I ask how is it advanced to the state consolidated funds, or does it go into a particular trust account in the state? How is it advanced first and then reimbursed against the criteria that is set by KeTSA? Would you be able to elaborate a little bit at the state level mechanism for us? Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Prita. So when we channel the funds, it does go into the consolidated fund of the state, but each grants that we give to the state do tend to be specific conditions, and basically for audit purposes, then the states have to comply. So for example, there's a specific allocation for road maintenance, and then they have to use it specifically for this. So similarly, when we channeled this specific allocation, I think this year, I think we also, it's partly also actually tied in to the current COVID crisis. We also wanted to make sure that our grants were given early to the states. So that's why we advanced not just the EFT and TAHAP grants, but other grants as well. But then again, it does come with conditions, and therefore the state would then need to comply with those. I maybe just wanted to respond to what Ms. Gan was mentioning. Actually, by constitution, if any state is in a deficit position, we actually do automatically do assist those states in question. So we wouldn't want to hold back money from states with a deficit problem to entice some conditions. But certainly, maybe it's a food for thought to look into when someone asks about this issue about debt for nature. I guess maybe what they're specifically referring to is on the on the debt that the federal government has lent to the state governments. There's more than it's about almost 25 billion outstanding. A biggest portion actually relates to what do you call it? Lending to the states for water infrastructure, and arguably there's some link there. So maybe that's one area that we could study.
Yes, thank you, Datuk. Just following up on that, when you mentioned food for thought, earlier in one of your slides, you talked about that some of the possible barriers for implementation of EFT would be the equity principle when it came to the distribution against the ecological criteria. Some would argue that that's possibly inimical to EFT itself, in the sense that in some countries, universally, they talk about positive discrimination. That means they don't work on the equity principle, that they give the monies to states, hoping to incentivize action from other states to actually do better, so that then they come on par with what the other states are doing. Is that something worth considering in the policy discourse? Because I would also think that going down the trajectory of equity, especially when you're designing ecological criteria in that sense, and some states would be more advantageous than the other, would be in some cases be a difficult thing to do. What is your take on possibly not going too much on the equity principle, but more on value and giving it to that side of things?
Yeah. No. Maybe just I need to explain a little bit. So I guess what I meant by equity, and maybe I might refer back to that earlier slide. If you then look by the size of gazetted areas, obviously, the size of gazetted areas, say for example in Sabah, Sarawak, is obviously so many times more larger than in all the other states. If it was based purely on that criteria, I guess I felt that the limited, modest funds that we were able to apply would just go into maybe those two states, and maybe leaving precious little for other states. Whereas, again, this could be controversial, but you could argue that, for example, the state of Sarawak, is a state with surplus budget. But obviously, on the face of it, you'd say that no, hang on, they've got among the largest protected areas, therefore they should get the largest amount. So I guess where I'm coming from, equity is maybe to help. Maybe it could be a poorer state, maybe for example Kelantan, who is a state in a poorer financial position, and that's where we maybe want to, actually it is in the spirit of positive discrimination, want to then maybe, if they are to incentivize them more to, reduce maybe reliance on logging revenues, and ideally not just look at the existing stock of protected areas, but maybe to encourage even relatively small states to gazette newer areas to increase the land restricted for land use. But having said that, it was a consideration, but in the end, the allocation was still weighted towards those with larger gazetted areas. So, for example, Sabah in the end received the largest portion of the EFT by virtue of its size and efforts they're making.
Right. Thank you, Datuk. So that's possibly my cue to ask a question of Dr. Naim. Dr. Naim, thank you for your presentation. Do you think you could elaborate a little bit on the process that you're undertaking or have undertaken in relation to developing the criteria, the ecological EFT criteria? I think that would be beneficial to understand at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Prita, for the question. Can you hear me? Okay. What is the process of actually developing the criteria of EFT? From KeTSA point of view, more stakeholder consultations are needed in order for us to fine-tune the scope that has been developed by KeTSA. For information, KeTSA had a discussion with our counterpart in Ministry of Agriculture and Food Industry from Department of Fisheries in order to get their views on marine protected areas. We also call upon our respective agencies in order to look at the potential criteria that could be incorporated for the purpose of EFT. In general, what I can share here is that EFT can be used for 3 different categories. First, it can be used for biodiversity conservation for protected, terrestrial protected or forested areas. It may in permanent forest reserve, eco park, peatlands, etc. Number 2, it can also be used for marine protected areas. And the third one is to actually use it for biodiversity conservation on important or vulnerable areas. It can be used for environmental sensitive area, wildlife reserve, wetland, etc. Of course, we are aiming for the funding to be used in increasing the national coverage of protected areas through gazettement of new areas within the state. But KeTSA is still looking at the possible options and will fine-tune the scopes and the criteria through consultative process with relevant stakeholders. I would also like to share here the 9 scopes proposed for the use of allocation under EFT. But as I mentioned earlier, these scopes will be further discussed with stakeholders. In the scope, it is clearly indicated that EFT can be used for inventory, monitoring. It can also be used for communication, education, and public awareness, capacity building, helping to strengthen the enforcement, recovery and restoration projects, upgrading and maintenance of infrastructures that could lead to enrichment of sites that probably can be enhance its ecotourism values for borders and zoning, and also for nursery and treatment. I have the 9 list of scopes with me. Probably for those interested, we will call for internal stakeholder consultation to discuss this further. Since this year, the disbursement of EFT will be based on TAHAP, and Datuk Johan has shared with us some of the formula used to come up with the figure to be disbursed to the state. So by next year, we hope that we can come out with a better implementation mechanism for EFT. Thank you, Ms. Prita.
Thank you, Dr. Naim. I think this would be the right time to possibly go into some of the questions. I noticed that some of the panelists have already answered them live, so I'll pick out the ones that I think might be most pertinent, and I'll be able to pool some of the questions together. Ms. Gan, I'll start with one of the earliest ones that came in from Ms. I think it's from RSPO, or it has been answered already. And the question on debt for nature has already been answered. We have a question from Alina Almeida from the British High Commission. And she's not directing it to any panel member, so anyone's free to chip into this. What governance processes are in place to ensure proper governance and coordination among relevant government departments such as KeTSA, KASA, EPU, MOF, and state governments in relation to EFT? And also, how do you rate successes to increases in EFT's impact in relation to climate change? I suppose that's another dimension. It involves another ministry as well. So how are we coordinating EFT in respect of these cross type of coordination issues? Is there anyone who'd like to take this question on?
I'll start off by doing the simple part, then maybe pass the difficult part to Dr. Naim. So certainly we have been obviously working closely with KeTSA and also with the state governments, both in terms of, at least first in this very early stage of implementing this new EFT in terms of how it can be used, and that was already explained a bit by Dr. Naim. And certainly we are trying to then do better in terms of coordinating with the states on ensuring that they do make use of this grant, as I mentioned previously, was not fully utilized. So certainly there, and in terms of governance, I didn't mention that even the introduction of this EFT, besides just being announced in the budget speech, actually its introduction and even this the recent increase, it's an item that's even discussed at our Majlis Kewangan Negara, which is actually a annual meeting held between, it's chaired by the Prime Minister and attended by all the Menteri Besar. In fact, even like on EFT, there was even a discussion that I think initially we had taken into account more in terms of the forest areas, and then I think the Chief Minister Sarawak had commented that, oh no, you need to really also take into account coastlines, given mangroves are a key biodiversity asset to be protected. And certainly, so there is certainly a governance between federal and state government, and certainly coordination between the relevant federal ministries on this matter.
Right. Thank you, Dato. Dr. Naim, would you like to contribute, or would you like me to go into a follow-up question that talked about governance? It also talked about how would we actually monitor and evaluate systems in place for EFT. So I think this is really asking the question of how are we evaluating and we are getting the ROI on the EFT. This comes from Mr. Sanath Kumaran, and here's a slightly more serious tone. He says, are there any punitive measures after funds are dispersed to the states who do not comply with biodiversity protection and etc.?
Thank you, Ms. Prita. Interesting, yeah, when we talk about punishment in order to get done of whatever objective that we have put in front. I also would like to reflect a number of questions from Ms. Elina, Zara Pang, Dr. Rospida, Dr. Amran, Mr. Abraham Nagu, Dr. Siva, Mr. Julian, that they have highlighted a number of good criteria to be incorporated when we develop EFT criteria. But the institutionalized of EFT is very crucial, as we need a clear mechanisms and indicators. I have highlighted the importance of quality indicators. In the first round of EFT, way back in 2019, the criteria is only based on the area of protected areas for each states. But moving forward, we need to impose the quality indicators with a clear mechanism so that we can monitor the spending of EFT. This can be achieved through a number of measures. I reiterate again, it also be part of 7 key conditions of an effective EFT, where we need an effective governance. That means we need a competitive entity, competent entity that can really implement and monitor the implementation of EFT. At the same time, policy and legal framework is also very important. From my point of view, the best way to institutionalize EFT is to enact additional provision in our existing laws that allow for EFT to be given consistently. as we all aware, EFT was provided in budget 2019, but not in budget 2020, and we only get it back in budget 21. Therefore, we need a very strong legislation framework to make sure we get a consistent budget for the purpose of EFT. Law probably will take time to yield the benefits, but I think it can be initiated for the long term planning. Further, we need to increase capacity. We need to increase capacity of the states to manage the funds allocated by EFT in a more sustainable manner. That means we looking forward to get the impact of EFT that will support the commitment of our nation. For instance, we have our commitment under Aichi biodiversity target of 20% our protected areas, terrestrial protected areas, and 10% marine protected areas. And if we follow the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, the CBD parties is actually trying to push for 30% of protected areas by 2030. But we need to put our national circumstances in order to make it work for our country. We also need sustainable financial tools that will help the states to implement EFT effectively. We need to provide clear guidance and also the condition for EFT to be used by the states. There are also needs for capacity building on prioritization of conservation intervention at state level. Yeah, while there are many areas that need improvement, EFT funds should go where it is most needed. If let's say the priority is to enhance sustainable livelihood of local communities and indigenous people, so it must be used for that specific purpose. If let's say it wanted to be used for conservation of key biodiversity areas, it should be go to that component so that it can produce a great impact of the result. But I think besides having all these criteria, the monitoring and evaluation mechanism is very important for us to make use of the performance criteria for the next disbursement. We take into account the performance of states that have been utilized the EFT, and we can factor in the performance criteria for the next disbursement onward. Thank you, Ms. Prita.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Naim. Whenever you mention the law, that's music to my ears, personally. I'm going to belabor the point on the criteria just a bit longer, Dr. Naim, because I can see there's a lot of questions coming in on this. I'm going to try and pool them together so that you can answer this, and I can move on to Ms. Gan and Datuk in a bit. The criteria-based questions, I have one from Mr. Julian Hyde, and there's another from Dr. Sivanandan. The questions is whether the criteria basically also look at other criteria. You mentioned value criteria just now. Could you give us an example of what exactly you mean by value-based criteria, and whether there's actually operational criteria, for example, and also criteria that involves looking at other policy documents as well, such as the National Protected Areas Framework and other documents. Could you elaborate a little bit on how robust or how overarching the criteria will be in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Prita, and also for participants that posted this burden question. Actually, the scopes that have been proposed to Ministry of Finance has taken into account various criteria, including from our national, the draft of national framework of protected areas developed under PA financing project under UNDP. For example, I can give you here, EFT can be used for conservation of existing forest and marine protected area. To add new protected areas with emphasis on the quality criteria of area management. A, to develop, review and implement management plans, payment for ecosystem services studies, determination of carrying capacity and activities for environmentally sensitive areas, wildlife reserve, areas of international interest, marine protected areas, marine protected parks and ecotourism parks. As far as the scope falls under developing and reviewing of implementing management plans, so the EFT funds can be used for this purpose. So another example is to implement programs to develop shared responsibility for the management of protected areas with the local community. So in this regard, I will also answer to Dr. Rospida question on the need of incorporating community-based criteria, because community depends on biodiversity for their livelihood. The funds can also be used to protect, to carry out restoration and enrichment project in the permanent forest reserve, wildlife reserve, implement projects and activities involving community participation, etc. So I think we can further fine-tune these scopes by having more consultations with respective stakeholders. For your information also, KeTSA has developed the evaluation criteria so that the quality indicators can be measured. Among other, scoring for evaluation is by looking at how state govern the EFT funds, how many community will get the benefits in the project of EFT, etc. So I can say that our document or proposal is still raw, and we need more input from stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naim. We have another question. It's more of a statement, but it's something to ponder upon. And I think maybe Datuk Johan and Ms. Gan, you could possibly reflect on this. There's a question from Encik Abdul Rahim Nik from ASM. I think that's Academy Science Malaysia. He says, besides the positive effects of EFT, the downside of EFT could be that the states would not take effective initiatives until and unless EFTs are provided to them. In the end, we would like to see the states take more assertive actions in conservation efforts for the resources belong to them. So is there a need to reflect on whether something that's going to be incentive based turns out to be a disincentive or a barrier? Is there any real worry that this statement might be a reflection of something that is already underpinning efforts at the state level?
Maybe I can start first. I think we agree with the principle that state governments, or governments in general, should be motivated, to do their part, without the need for a financial incentive. I mean, I think it must be something that governments want to do, and therefore, introduce various programs and the rest towards that. But having said that, even where there is intent by government, whether at the federal or state, like it or not, and this may be more of an issue at the state governments. State governments do have their own financial constraints, and therefore, on one hand, some have the pressure of trying to generate revenues potentially from land use, whether it's logging or mining, to balance the needs of them to deliver on their services at the state level. So on that level, it can't hurt that, to the extent that federal government is able to provide some funds to ease that pressure on revenue is one, and number two, maybe something that I'm not sure how it can be captured into EFT, but where states want to undertake certain projects that support the environment agenda, then there probably is value in federal government being ready to have some funds available to support. So where there are states that want to do something, there should be maybe some funds available to support such states where they have the intent. But because ultimately at the end of the day, it does require resources. So I think EFT, it's obviously not a silver bullet. It will not solve making people want to do something, but hopefully it will help support those who want to do something but don't have enough resources.
Understood. Ms. Gan, would you like to chime in on that as well?
I think for EFT to work, that obviously would need to have a lot of engagement and conversation between federal and state to manage and realign the expectations, on the agreed principles and also the indicators and how the EFT allocation will be used. The way the EFT works is, of course, presumably in Malaysia, we already resolved the case of revenue, as the first tier. Then second tier is to design, how the EFT should work, which in this sense, we hope that we can provide some form of incentives to motivate the states, to take up and to perform their functions and mandates, in relations to environment, natural resources and land, as per the federal constitutions. And then, of course, the third one, of course, we will need to, of course, agree on the indicators. Everyone agree on these sets of principles that this is how ecological fiscal transfer allocation will be determined and dispersed to the states. And of course, then the down layer will be, what kind of conservation actions or efforts, the type of, how the allocation should be used, on the ground. Whether the state, if we are transferred from Ministry of Finance, federal level to the state treasury. Once the state treasury receives the funds, the state government should be already have a sense of what kind of, strategies, conservation strategies on actions or the type of projects or initiatives they want to implement at the state. Be it they want to get it implemented through the state agencies, with the environmental mandate, such as, like in Perak, you have Perak State Park Corporation, or in Johor, you will have Johor National Park Corporation, same in Sabah, you have Sabah Parks, or Sabah Forestry Department, all the forestry departments, to get this implemented, or you want to partner with the NGOs, to carry out some of the ground conservation efforts, which sometimes, government agency may not have the reach, to reach these communities or even to reach these areas. So, which is why I think there is a lot of consideration even from the revenue side, from the design, the criteria, and then the disbursement mechanism, and then of course, finally, the type of actions that needs to take place on the ground.
Yes, I suppose that would also involve a lot of priority setting, wouldn't it, Ms. Gan? It wouldn't be such an open-ended concept such as the environmental agenda per se, because it's such a cross-sectional, multi-dimensional issue, which also ties into what Dr. Naim said earlier. I was wondering how you would reconcile EFT contributing to the national biodiversity policy as against the ecological criteria, and how the states then respond to the national biological diversity and the ecological criteria that's actually being set. So I think there's a lot of reconciliation that needs to be done, taking in consideration of the state's priorities as well as the national biodiversity policy. That was just a comment from myself. I'd like to move on to another question. This is for you, Datuk, from Farah Ashray. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. She says, as a nation with such biodiversity and richness, do you think our reporting on government expenditure can carve out environment-related expenditure and have it stand alone rather than calculated or reported under the banner of social, and we should encourage states to do the same. May I get MOF's view on this? Dr. Johan, would you like to tackle this one?
Maybe let Dr. Naim and Ms. Gan want to go first, maybe.
Yes, maybe Ms. Gunn, we've talked about environmental budget reporting. Maybe you can highlight maybe if this is something that we should start looking into and aggregate some of the allocations and expenditure for the environment.
I think we can start off with an initiative that we did in partnership with the Economic Planning Unit and also with KeTSA about 5 years ago, which is called the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, or in short, BioFin. So through that exercise, we follow a methodology, to actually look at what is our expenditure for biodiversity conservation in Malaysia. So we did that by looking at the financial need, by looking at the actual expenditures from starting from 2011 to 2016 or 2018, I remember. So mainly from the development expenditure or development budget allocated under the 10 and 11 Malaysia Plan. And we also look at the operating expenditure that some of these agencies, some of the biodiversity related agencies, they receive, on an annual budgetary basis. So we did a calculation and look at the actual expenditure, and we tagged that, against the 17 targets of the national policy on biological diversity 2016 to 2025, and we managed to come out and devise an amount that is more or less, you can say this is like a tagging exercise, for biodiversity. So we are still finalizing the report. We hope to launch it, and share, but of course, this has to be also in doing so in finalizing together with KeTSA and also EPU, just to verify the final figures. So just to let you know, we have begun such an exercise under the BioFin to start tagging our expenses or expenditures for biodiversity in Malaysia. But we're only able to do it at the federal level, mostly involving our federal government agencies. Mainly the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources and its line agencies like Perhiritan, Forestry Department, but we are not able to do it at the state level yet. Hopefully with the BioFin Phase 2, which we are about to launch soon, we'll be able to select, some interested states to participate, so we can actually tag some of the expenditures they spent, over a period of time, on biodiversity.
Thanks, Ms. Khan. Following from that, so how specific? Yeah, sorry, Datuk, go ahead.
Sorry. Once Ms. Gan mentioned about the tagging, it helped remind me that actually, as you're aware, the EPU drives the reporting of expenditure or performance against the SDGs. And so that is, I think, reported annually by EPU, and certainly for all our development expenditure projects, those in a set are tagged to SDG. And so what we have just started at MOF and alluded by Puan Zakiah is that we've also started tagging our operating expenditure as well to SDGs, but that's an ongoing process. And so, we should soon basically have an integrated sort of report that covers by SDG book, not just in terms of our development expenditure projects, but also our operating expenditure projects, operating expenditure budgets.
Yes, thank you. I think at the end of the day, Ms. Khan, just leaving this question behind very quickly from your side. This tagging of environmental expenditure that you mentioned and that's what mentioned earlier, what's this actually going to help us with? at the end of the day? What is it going to help us with specifically on environmental allocation and spending, and more specifically on EFT? What are the lessons we're hoping to learn that might translate into more efficacy or adequacy or sufficiency when it comes to funding? Would you be able to tell us a little bit about that?
I think by tagging the expenditures in the past, it actually gives us an indication, of how much we need to finance or to implement the conservation actions in Malaysia. So be it at the very aggregate level or at the national level. In a sense, it also tells us, how much funds or how much money we need to implement the entire national policies that involve 17 targets and many, many strategies and actions. So by doing the tagging, it also points to what is our financial needs. And eventually, by knowing the financial needs, it will lead us to how we should mobilize the financial resources, given that, let's say we need 10 billion for conservation actions in the next 10 years. So how should we mobilize these resources, in the next 10 years, given that it's a mix of different finance mechanisms or finance solutions that we already have in place, such as, of course, EFT is definitely one of the consideration, one of the options. And on top of that, the usual development expenditure that you receive from the 5-year Malaysia plan, the annual operating budget, and of course, other innovative financing mechanisms that we have through the RED Plus finance framework, if we have, or carbon offsets, all this mixture, or even private sector, where you can launch a sustainability sukuk, whether all these as a mixture of different finance solutions will be able to generate the kind of financial resources that we already determined in this exercise, from tagging, expenditure review, to financial needs assessment, and eventually your resource mobilization plan, as already, as Dr. Naim already rightly pointed out in his presentation.
Maybe just to add on. Sorry, Peter, I don't know whether I could quite hear you. I think you're on mute. But just to add on to what Ms. Gan said, I think, okay, so certainly budget transparency is something that we still, it's an ongoing process, at least for us. But to some extent, having some transparency over the allocations does then help support accountability with stakeholders. I was just looking through the questions just now, and I just suddenly noticed, I mentioned that in budget 2020, we had set aside 15 million for various animal initiatives, but I noticed someone from MyCat said that they didn't receive that allocation. So maybe that's a good question, because the Ministry of Finance, a central agency, then allocates it to a ministry, and then the ministry then is supposed to disperse it over the various. And maybe it's good then that they know how much is supposed to go, and they then can question us if that funds are not coming down. And sometimes also, as what Ms. Khan mentioned, we can have the amount allocated, but does it achieve the right outcomes? And sometimes we will be the first to admit that sometimes not all types of, shall we say, efforts are necessarily best done by government. I think for that reason, even, for example, the partnership that we did with UNDP on the small projects for community-led projects amongst the Orang Asli. Sometimes for whatever reason, maybe the communities or NGOs in the Orang Asli space don't work, with, say, Jaafar on that type of project. Sometimes it's best going through, either multilaterals like yourself or even through NGOs. And so maybe by also having reporting of amounts, and then linked to some qualitative factors, as what Dr. Naim was stressing, that you can't just look at the numbers, sometimes you have to look at the quality of the outcomes. That then helps us, self-assess and see whether we can then better improve the modality or mechanisms in which we are channeling these funds.
Thank you for that. I think that leads me very nicely, Dato, when you talked about transparency and accountability, to two questions that I'm going to actually attempt to tie up from WWF Malaysia, from Ms. Sarah Dambal and Ms. Shantini Gunarajan. The question is, how do we understand the quantum for fiscal transfer at the federal level is determined, be it EFT or any other type, is there a difference between allocation for a TAHAP or a legislative-based fiscal transfer? And tied to that question is the question on whether there will be steps needed to institutionalize EFT to ensure that it is featured in the annual budget in the long term. So it is a question of whether it's a recurring thing through the law, through TAHAP, in the annual budget as well. For example, like the capitation grant, which is provided for in the federal constitution. So in that regard, is there a need to amend existing legislation or the federal constitution in the long term, or is it sufficient to use existing processes and presumably the TAHAP?
Sorry, I suddenly lost you, Rita.
Yes, I was wondering whether you'd like to attempt this question about institutionalization and how do you actually arrive at the quantum in fiscal transfer, specifically the TAHAP one. Thank you.
But first, maybe in terms on transparency, I'm not sure whether those attending this might be aware. We do actually disclose, there's an appendix in our annual, what do you call it, buku anggaran perbelanjaan, our annual budget book or annual allocation book. Most people just look at the allocation by ministries, but there's an appendix almost right at the back of a very thick book, which then shows the allocation by state and by type of disbursements. And there's even a column for capitation grant, there's a column by for TAHAP, which is then broken down by state. So there is disclosure of that amount. I think I'll be very transparent. The reason why perhaps we've not yet disclosed the criteria for example, the EFT is in recognition that at least in the first couple of years, it's still a very raw attempt. And, as even what Dr. Khairul Naim mentioned, we use really just based on just quantitative numbers. And even then, based on protected areas, which again, not perfect, but it was something as a start. And so not even talking about public stakeholders, it'll be one of those that certainly our colleagues in the state governments would contest quite vociferously. So we took the option, let us just try first for a couple of years, based on those criteria. Now that we're working closely with KeTSA for next year to then have even a more extensive thing, I think we want it to, shall we say, stabilize, and for us to be comfortable that, it is being allocated fair before maybe we want to disclose the formula, because I think we want it to be stabilized first on that front. In terms of institutionalizing, I think because we have now incorporated as part of annual state transfer, that hopefully gives that, for lack of a better, a signal to the state governments that there is this long-term commitment for EFT. And then the challenge is maybe then it is for the likes of MOF, according to its financial capabilities, to look at how it can then gradually increase that allocation over time. But I guess, so as I mentioned, it's even discussed at our MKN Majlis Kewangan Negara level. So it is, in that sense, that I guess are steps towards institutionalizing this as a grant.
Thank you, Dr. Chuan. That's quite a revelation. Thank you for sharing that. I'll give you and Ms. Gunn a break and move over to Dr. Naim for a bit. There's a question from Inche Aldri Ame for you specifically, Dr. Naim. He talks about protecting habitats is the super best formula to ensure the maintenance of biology and ecosystem services. Has KeTSA decided on concrete strategies and targets to ensure impactful EFT implementation, such as the comprehensive identification of target areas to be protected, converting all forested state lands and environmentally sensitive areas into totally protected areas, maybe, and so forth, and whether there's going to be a banning of degazettement and such activities which we don't want to encourage. To take that one on?
Thank you, Ms. Prita. Thank you, Dr. Aldri, for posting the question. As I highlighted earlier, the key target of EFT is to increase our protected areas. By having a certain percentage of protected areas, we can further enhance our conservation efforts. We not only conserve the habitats, but we can also conserve the flora and fauna that exist in the habitat. EFT can also be used to support our national initiative. We have two big initiatives in Semenanjung, which is our central forest spine. We can use EFT to implement the CFS master plan in order to improve the connectivity, doing all the enrichment, restoration, enrichment of habitat, etc. It can also be used for Heart of Borneo initiative involving three countries, Sabah and Sarawak. The strategy of putting more funding for ecosystem will be benefited not only to the species, but also to the indigenous people and local communities that living near or in the protected areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naim.
Ms. Prita, can I also respond to what have been highlighted by Ms. Gan on biofin,
Please do,
biodiversity finance initiative?
Please do.
Yeah, because we all know that government funding is relatively small to cover all efforts for conservation. And Datuk Johan suggested that we need more actors to be involved in supporting our financial resources. So I think if we look at the biofin study outcome, it shows that the funding for biodiversity conservation is mainly come from government. And we have a big gap in achieving or in implement actions under national policy on biodiversity if we couldn't get any extra financial resources from other instrument. Thus, I think we need greater non-government involvement. We need to also explore other innovative financing mechanism. REIT Plus, for instance, REIT Plus has developed its REIT Plus financing framework that probably can complement EFT, or it can be implemented concurrently. I would also like to update what was happening in our negotiation recently under the Convention on Biodiversity, whereby many parties have suggested the target of 1% of national GDP towards biodiversity conservation. As of now, our percentage GDP towards biodiversity conservation is relatively low. It's only about 0.06%. Probably when we talk about institutionalization, we should also consider a consistent figure or consistent percentage specifically for biodiversity conservation.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Naim. Just probably one last question before I ask the panel to round up with their thoughts and ideas or perspectives on the way forward. There's one question from Faradun Khosrawi, who's asking whether the private sector or actors be able to contribute towards enabling the recipients of the EFT, and if so, how? Dr. Johan, is that a question for you to answer, whether other independent private sector actors can contribute towards the EFT, and if they can, how do they do that? How do they go about doing that?
Sorry, I'm trying to. Okay, the reason I'm hesitating for a while because I'm just trying to think through in terms of process, because the EFT as it's currently structured, it's really going to be based on certain criteria, and once the criteria are met, it's then based on that, there being a determination of amount to then be allocated to the state, and then the state will be given certain criteria what type of projects, which I think Dr. Naim explained on some of that. So so it does not immediately come to mind unless it's them directly working with the state on their plans, because then the state wouldn't be able to use the EFT to then help execute those plans. That's my attempt that's not really being very sure. But I think at the same time, as I think during my presentation, we certainly at the federal government are also looking to see how we can improve our general public delivery. I know my colleagues at EPU speak about this alternative service delivery. As I mentioned, recognizing that sometimes there's some things that federal government isn't the best party to implement. Even like during this crisis, for example, we find that soup kitchens generally get better done by NGOs, for example, than expecting a government department to try to disperse food. So, we're certainly remain open to suggestions on how the government can work better through partnerships with whether it's civil society, NGOs, and others. But certainly on the sustainability agenda, I think one thing which Puan Zakiah emphasized is the need to try to see whether we can better involve more the private sector, because I think that's a key part that really for sustainability, we need their active involvement in this agenda.
Thank you.
May I add on, Ms. Prita?
Yes, very quick.
Very quick one. One of the suggested criteria under EFT is to implement programs to develop shared responsibility for the management of protected area. It may in the form of co-management with the local community, or perhaps with private sector in the form of private conserve area. So I think by having this kind of criteria, we can encourage more non-government actors to be involved in conservation.
Thanks, Dr. Naim. I'm going to go in the reverse and close with you for the panel discussion with one last question. I think that probably might sum up what a lot of the participants are feeling. The question is from Zara Fang. How can one be involved with the stakeholders consultation on the criteria? Dr. Naim?
Thank you, Ms. Prita. Thank you for those asking the question as well. How could they contribute together with KeTSA and other relevant stakeholders in actually developing a good EFT criteria that can serve our ultimate purpose? For your information, we at KeTSA is in the midst of reviewing our national policy on biological diversity. So target 17 of NPBD clearly stated the importance of improving our resource mobilization. And one of the actions is on ecological fiscal transfers. So probably we will be having many stakeholders consultations for the KBK for NPBD revision. So I hope that we can use that platform to gain more input from the stakeholders. Besides that, we also will convene a number of stakeholder consultations specifically for EFT. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naim. Dr. Johan, could I ask you for some parting words on possibly how you see EFT evolving or improving the trajectory, or what is MOF going to do by way of processes in terms of EFT into the future?
I think from where MOF sits, I think we have to see EFT as just one of the jigsaw as part of a broader plan on how we work with the state to encourage them to step up their commitment and in terms of this agenda. But I think given it's just one piece of the jigsaw, certainly as what also I presented and what Dr. Naim talked about shared responsibility, we certainly look forward to seeing how we can then also build bridges with other actors, whether it's the likes of UNDP and other civil society, the private sector particularly, and also NGOs. What more can we do as taking steps towards advancing this going forward? So we're certainly are open for greater and deeper partnerships.
Thank you, Dr. John. I'm very sure that the other partners in civil society in particular are looking very much forward to engaging with MOF on a number of these issues and conservation at large. Ms. Gunn, so can I ask you to provide some perspectives on how you see EFT moving forward, the UNDP perspective on the whole issue of EFT, and what initiatives we can look forward to coming from the organization?
Yeah, I think from UNDP, we are in a position to support the process, in particularly, KeTSA's effort to engage with various stakeholders in the design and determination of the EFT criteria, or even to a certain extent, if you want to put in place a new or review the current legislative framework to institutionalize the EFT. This will be done because we have managed to secure some resources from our Biofin Phase 2 project, which amounts to about $500,000 for this process. And we have identified that EFT will be one of the finance solutions that we can work with, partner closely with MOF and also with KeTSA. So this is still in the works, and we hope to start the process, supporting this effort journey with all the stakeholders, probably, in the second half of this year. Yeah. The other thing I also like to, pertaining to the earlier questions about, how EFT, can be, leverage as a lever to capitalize on other sources of financial resources in the states. I think it works perfectly with the allocations for the federal. So certain states, if they have their own, some schemes like, payment for ecosystem services for certain water catchment areas, they can actually use this EFT as a co-financing, to attract the private sector contributions in the form of a payment of ecosystem services. Obviously, this webinar will not be enough to engage in a more detailed discussion, but this will be definitely only a first series of a lot more webinar sessions about EFT and relevant finance solutions in the country. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Khan. I'm hoping we don't have any more webinar sessions after this. Can actually look forward to more physical sessions in engagement of this process. So suffice it to say that there's a lot more discussed on EFT that is needed to basically, whether it's to institutionalize or to look at the criteria, discuss the criteria, the allocations per se, the distribution, the disbursement, and at the end of the day, the outcome of the EFT distribution. So on that note, I would like to thank all the panelists for very patiently answering all the questions. And I would like to thank all the attendees today for posing the questions. And I'm sorry that I could not attend to all of them, but thank you for your initiative and thank you for sending them in. And do trust that there will be future engagement on the ecological fiscal transfer issues. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to moderate this session. So I'll hand this back to Hanisa to end the session.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Preeta.
Thanks, Preeta.
Thank you, Preeta.
Thank you, Ms. Preeta and all the panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at the end of the session. To conclude the webinar, allow me to introduce Ms. Manon, the Deputy Resident Representative of UNDP Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam, to give the closing remark. Ms. Manon.
Distinguished guests and participants, we are already at the end of this first webinar, very, I would say, engaging and substantive on ecological fiscal transfer in Malaysia. I was quite impressed by the level of engagement, number of questions, depth of the conversation that we were able to have today from a diversity of stakeholder engaged throughout this webinar. Before I try to summarize some of the key takeaways from today's webinar, I would like on behalf of UNDP and the participants to really extend my heartfelt thanks to our wonderful partners, Datuk Johan Merican from the National Budget Director from the Ministry of Finance of Malaysia, and Dr. Khairul Naim, Undersecretary of Biodiversity Management Division of the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources, Malaysia. We really appreciate that you took your time today to share your views, your knowledge, engage in very rich discussion that we hope will advance the conversation on how best to implement ecological fiscal transfer in Malaysia. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Puan Zakiah, the Deputy Secretary General of Treasury of the Ministry of Finance of Malaysia, for being with us during the opening of this first series of UNDP webinar and events that we have launched to celebrate the 55th years of development partnership between Malaysia and UNDP. So let me try to summarize very briefly some of the key takeaways from the very rich discussion today. I think fiscal transfer may not be new in its practice, and we saw today that in other countries with federation system, such as Australia, Brazil, India, Indonesia, they have quite a rich experience to share with us. And it does present a very promising, innovative finance solution for Malaysia to address the dichotomy of federal and states in their respective mandate and jurisdictions on environment and natural resources. I think today we have learned from participating ministries what is being done and what could be done to design and operationalize the ecological fiscal transfer in Malaysia to advance the implementation of Malaysia's policy action for biodiversity conservation. UNDP is honored to be the bridge of this important endeavor that connects policymakers and other stakeholders. So in summary, these are the three key messages that we can draw from this first discussion. First, ecological fiscal transfer can be a game-changing solution. The budget announcement by the government of Malaysia in 2019 and 2021 really creates strategic opportunity that provide fundamental conditions to incentivize states to perform their mandates in conservation. Neither the state can achieve the environmental SDGs alone. This demands a shared approach in the right mix of fiscal incentives. Second, there was a lot of discussion, EFT to work effectively in a sustainable manner, it needs to be grounded on sound policy or legal instrument and a public institution with cross-cutting mandate and functions, an influential power across different levels of governance in the country. Third, integrated whole of government and stakeholder approaches are critical in the design of the EFT. There was quite, I think, a lot of expression from the different stakeholders and reference as well by our panelists on the importance of bringing civil society, private sector, and both level of governments to discuss the different environmental criteria and parameter that will determine the budget allocation to each state, and how should this incentive be utilized for conservation action on the ground and proper monitoring and evaluation mechanism. Puan Zakiah mentioned in her opening remarks that sustainability and the SDGs are now a firm agenda reflected in budget 2021, and that MOFA now can talk business. UNDP will continue to support the government of Malaysia in this important journey. And I'm pleased to announce that UNDP will launch the Global Biodiversity Finance Initiative Phase 2 project in close partnership with the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Natural Resources. So we hope that this will be an opportunity to really support all the stakeholders in the implementation journey of the EFT. I would like to thank again the moderators, speakers, panelists, and the participants for your active participation today. I really hope that this is only the beginning of the conversation, online or on-site, but UNDP surely looks forward to working with all of you and facilitate conversation that will help Malaysia pilot, learn, and find the right model to ensure an impactful EFT implementation. So finally, as we are in conjunction with the World Environment Day 2021 theme of ecosystem restoration, I'd like to take this opportunity to launch the Puli Alam Kita Restore Our Nature photography competition that will start today until the 11th of July. And UNDP Malaysia invites all of you to disseminate and showcase your best photos of our country's ecological wonders as we join the global call to restore our ecosystem and safeguard our biodiversity. Together, we can educate, inform, and inspire our communities on why ecosystems matter to all of us. So thank you very much, everyone, for your participation, to our panelists, and looking forward to the continuity of our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Manon. Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. We hope that you found the presentation and the dialogue informative and insightful. We would also like to extend our appreciation to the panelists and moderator of today's session. A recording of the event will be available at UNDP website after a few days if you would like to rewatch the session or share with your friend and colleague. We look forward to bring you more policy dialogue in the future.